Hello, my name is Lutfey Siddiqi. I'm an adjunct professor at the National University of Singapore and a visiting professor in practice at the London School of Economics. And I will be the moderator of this panel titled Conscious Criteria for Global Business. It's been 5 years since the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and also the Paris Climate Agreement. In that period, more and more stakeholders, businesses, consumers, investors, have jumped onto the bandwagon. Responsive capitalism and responsible investing, these are terms that are now talked about in mainstream circles. Are these merely fashionable terms, or are they genuine forces of progress towards fair and inclusive growth? Are we expecting too much or too little from private sector resources? To unpack these questions, we have three distinguished guests with us here today. First up, Sophie Herken. Anna is Business Division Head of Allianz Asset Management, and amongst other things, a member of the board of Allianz Life USA. Anna, my first question to you is, what's the role of markets in supporting inclusive growth?
I think we see a very unique moment in global financial markets. And before the crisis, I remember there was a lot of discussion about or questions about where will sustainable finance actually develop to. And now in the current situation, we really see that we have an opportunity to refocus on sustainability and responsible investment. And what I perceive as very encouraging is that in the crisis, financial markets seem to recognize that ESG investing is not only about doing good, like reaching ESG targets, but you can actually generate alpha and mitigate risk. And we have first evidence that this is really becoming the truth. So I think this is a very encouraging message. And also, I really expect that after the crisis, we will see this whole area to become much, much stronger and really be a vital part of the financial industry.
But is it the right way to go? Is there a risk of tokenism, of people wanting to be seen to be doing things on the sustainability front, but actually not really going at it the whole hog? There's still some skepticism about doing good and doing well at the same time. Is it really possible?
I think that was the past where we had like many voices perceiving ESG investing much more as a niche product or something nice to have, like just to appear nice. But now we have all these very integrated approaches. And again, as I said, we see alpha generation, we see risk mitigation. So I think it has totally swapped sort of the perception from ESG as this nice doing good thing and to really being a core business, integrated business approach.
Great, that's very good to hear. Thank you for that, Anna. Next up is David Cruickshank. David is chair of the board of Social Progress Imperative. Until May of last year, he was chair of Deloitte Global, and before that, member of the Global Board of Directors of Deloitte for 8 years. David, my question for you is, how do we know that we're making progress? How do we measure social impact of investments?
Thank you very much. And I think it is the big question. I think we're no longer in an era where companies and investors question whether they should have an ESG agenda or whether they have responsibilities beyond their immediate shareholders to wider stakeholders. I think the vast majority of companies around the world accept that. But then you get to, well, how do you measure what you might do? And what SPI does is it provides data on how well citizens in countries, regions, communities, districts, right around the world are doing. So we've got 160 countries covered. We have data on 50 different measures, ranging from the very basics, are you fed and watered, right through to do you have equal opportunity rights in education, and so on, 50 different measures. So it's not economically based, but it's very interesting when you look in comparison between the Social Progress Index scores and GDP per capita in different places and see which countries are doing really well, making a lot of what they've got in terms of economic output, and those that are doing less well, where there's good economic output, but it's not converting into good outcomes for citizens. And companies are using that data. So companies are using it to help inform investment decisions. So at the moment, we're doing some projects in the US muni bond market where investors are looking at SPI scores for communities they're investing in to see whether they are sustainable, what needs to be done to improve them. And obviously, if you've got rising scores, you've got a lower risk investment, better return. If you've got declining scores, then it's probably a higher risk investment. Right through to companies like Cargill, Coca-Cola, and Natura, who are using SPI to inform decisions that they're making locally in their supply chains. What can they do to improve the lives of people in communities which their supply chains depend on? How can they improve outcomes? And they're using SPI scores for that. So I think it's data measurement. I think, as I said at the beginning, we're beyond the stage where people are asking, should we, shouldn't we? It's more, well, how do we do it and how do we measure whether we're being successful?
Thanks, David. Two questions come to mind. One is, this concept of Goodhart's law, that the act of measuring something changes the character of what we're trying to measure. It changes behavior of people who know that they are now being observed for something in particular. Do you see this in the social enterprise space? Is there mission creep because of that? And then secondly, is there a very heavy compliance burden on people who really should be focusing on the social impact as opposed to trying to report back on it?
I think they're good questions. I see it very much, companies would build this into business as usual. And so they will have scoreboards and KPIs, which, including the usual profitability and cash flows and so on, will include things like SPI scores against their ESG objectives and so on. And it is definitely true. You get what you measure, and having prominence for scores does mean they get management time. But also, I think it affects the way that the culture of an organization develops, because people realize it's important, because they're being measured on it, and they will behave accordingly. So I'm not saying measurement is the only answer, because you need leadership, you need the right strategy and so on. But for sure, if you don't measure things, then you can't get good outcomes.
That's very true. I mean, it's true even in the traditional businesses, traditional accounting. Just because you have accounting standards doesn't mean that the metrics speak for themselves. Anna, I'll come back to you in a short while, just to ask you whether, as an investor, whether you really find the SPI type metrics useful or not. If I could move to Naina now. Naina Subberwal Batra. Naina is the chairperson and CEO of AVPN, Asian Venture Philanthropy Network, fostering and supporting the entire ecosystem of social investors. Naina, my question for you is, what developments are you seeing in Asia when it comes to impact investing, and can they be replicated, hopefully in scale, elsewhere?
Thank you, Lutfey. The 2019 GIN, or the Global Impact Investing Network Annual Investor Survey, showed us that half of the investors surveyed planned to increase their allocations in food and agriculture, 48% to energy. And what we found is that from 2014 to 2018, the fastest growing sectors were infrastructure, 61% increase in terms of investment in portfolio, water, sanitation and hygiene were the next, and information and communication technology were the third. And target returns for most impact investors were between 4% to, between sort of 8% going all the way down to about 2% respectively. Within our network, we are the largest social investing network in Asia. And we have more than 650 members. We find that social investors in Asia are paying heed to this kind of growing body of evidence that is suggesting that incorporating an impact lens in their portfolio is actually critical, I think, as Anna mentioned, to not just do well, but not just do good, but also do well. what I think is interesting is that, we are finding, besides sort of looking at an impact investing lens or an ESG lens into their portfolio, we're finding that there is an increasing commitment amongst our members. So about 67% of our members have indicated a commitment to women and girls as their beneficiaries, or gender equality as one of their primary impact areas. It's also interesting that, not only are they supporting this through philanthropy, but they're actually looking at investing in organizations that promote equality, that promote equity, through making investments that, span debt and they span equity. However, having said that, I feel that the impact investment sector in Asia is still pretty nascent. We actually found that 2 out of 3 of our members are still at the early stages of building their practice and portfolio. However, 2 in 5 have indicated that there is a keen interest in growing their engagement in this space. And I think, Lutfey, one of the interesting things is that we are seeing the piloting of innovative sort of social finance products across Asia. So a lot of pay for performance products, a lot of SIBs, social impact bonds, development impact bonds are gaining huge popularity, not just amongst investors, but also amongst foundations that are looking at expanding their traditional portfolio from grant making to impact investing.
Terrific, thank you. I really like the structure of pay for performance products, where I believe the returns are conditional on the social outcomes. So you really converge the incentives really well. My follow-on question for you is, Naina, do you think there are definitional issues? What qualifies as impact investing? Do we still look for intentionality, additionality, that sort of stuff? Or can I, for example, set up a factory in a remote village providing jobs to the local community, perhaps women, but it's a tobacco factory, or it's Coca-Cola, sugar drink factory? Is that impact investing?
That's actually a really good question, and one that, I often want to answer. So as far as AVPN is concerned, I think for us, intentionality is key in terms of how we define an impact investment. There is a lot of skepticism because there is, and it goes back to the questions you were asking, David, around measurement. Because until and unless we have a standardized metric, it's going to be very difficult to socialize impact investment in the mainstream. Because what is it that constitutes impact, and how do you measure it? How do you also measure a potential investment in the education sector with one in terms of financial inclusion? So, if you're looking at investing in microfinance, one can argue that this is now very much more a mainstream investment, versus if you're looking at investing in, access to health and sanitation, maybe does that qualify as much more of a deeper impact? So for coming from my perspective and from AVPN's perspective, I think intentionality is key. And, the metrics that you're going to measure have to be there very much clearly in the beginning as you decide on whether or it's a go or a no-go as far as the investment is concerned.
Thank you. Anna, if I could come back to you as a provider of capital, do you like what you just heard? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, like both the point that you raised about definitions in data, that's pretty much the biggest challenge, because I think nowadays we all want to do good and we don't want to do cherry picking, we want to do integrated ESG. But if I just sort of even want to benchmark myself towards other asset managers, I can see that there are no clear definitions about what are certain ESG approaches. So I think that's something we need, global definitions that apply to everybody. And regarding data, I mean, like, that's our biggest challenge, because there is no standardized data out there. So we have little development within the European Union, but I think this is something we need to understand globally. How do we define certain ESG approaches, and how do we get the data for that? And that's our biggest challenge when we discuss it.
Right. And do you think it's possible to make progress on that so that this sector ever becomes something big enough, at scale enough to be really material?
I think we have encouraging signals from EU legislation, for example. So I think there's a lot happening. So let's see how this will sort of expand globally. But I think that's a good start. And it's actually incentivizing companies to take ESG serious. And on the data, I'm very optimistic because I think there'll be lots of innovative approaches.
I see. David, do you have anything to add?
Now, I think there's obviously the micro level data on this, what individual companies are doing, but sort of standing back from it and looking at what we should be doing collectively. One of the exercises that Social Progress Imperative has done is to look at the UN SDGs. And if you remember, the intention was that the world should have achieved its targets by 2030 when the SDGs were published. Well, following this year's SPI results, we mapped all the measurements from SPI against all the SDGs for everywhere in the world, well, the 160 countries that SPI covers. And we reckon up to March this year that it would take until 2082 to achieve the SDG targets. And then we extrapolated forward from that because, of course, since March, huge parts of the world have been struggling with COVID-19. And we reckon that will add another 10 years on. So I think if you sort of stand back from it and look at it all collectively, there's an awful lot of work to do. If we believe that achieving the UN SDGs was important, we are falling way behind where we should be. And so I think we sometimes just got to stand back and look at the macro as well as the micro for the individual companies and investors.
That's really what I meant by materiality and scale, because there looks like there's a rhetoric action gap or a knowing doing gap. I remember seeing a survey by one of the consulting firms about a year ago, where I think 3/4 of CEOs surveyed said that we would like our company to be actively promoting and fostering SDGs, but only about 1/4 of them knew how to do it. So the what is clear, the how is not. Is there a way to do more, do better in marshalling these well-intentioned corporations and investors, but at a much faster pace so that it isn't 2082 or 2092?
I think many companies have identified the SDGs where they themselves can have the biggest impact. But recognizing Anna's point, most of them have come up with their own measures as to how they're doing around those goals and their own targets. So in terms from an investor point of view, there's not a lot of comparability, but they are being open about it. And I think that's a big part of the challenge, talking about what is going on in the companies, what targets they've set themselves. I think the next step is to try and get more standardization so that there can be comparisons for investors.
Right. Naina, would you like to have the last word? We're into our last couple of minutes now.
Thanks, Lutfey. Yes, I agree. I think, we are pretty far away from meeting the SDGs, and especially here in Asia, we have a ways to go. I think if this crisis has shown us something, it's that it is imperative that we all come together to do this right now. And in order to do that, I feel that there is a role that needs to be played in tandem. So it's not just the large companies, it's also employees asking companies or their employers to step up. It's investors asking, making sure that their investments are responsible. It's also the regulatory authorities who have a role to play in terms of putting in place metrics that the financial markets recognize. Because unless and until we do that, we are not going to see, this change come at a scale which is needed. And like you said, 88 years, 98 years, 100 years, I don't think we can afford that. So it's really important for all of us to take on the role of being social investors and looking at more than a financial return to our investments.
Thank you so much, Naina. Thank you, David. Thank you, Anna. I actually am extremely optimistic. My line of questioning may not have revealed that, but I think we have a convergence of enlightened self-interest where investors in a zero interest rate environment are looking for, frankly, opportunities. And so we need to create new asset classes. And those that are inclusive, there's an investment case to be made for that. At the same time, companies are running out of growth segments. So inclusive growth is growth. It's what aligns with commercial growth. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you also to the audience for being with us. We'll bring this to a close now.